Captain James Whitfield stood in the officers' club at Nui Dat in August 1967 and listened to an Australian SAS officer decline an offer of comfortable quarters that would have been gratefully accepted by most military personnel. The Australian officer, a major named Thomas Duncan, had been offered a private room with air conditioning, electricity, and modern plumbing. Duncan had declined the offer. "We prefer to stay in the field accommodation," Duncan said simply. "We are more comfortable in the mud than in comfortable quarters." Whitfield found this response puzzling. Comfortable quarters represented a significant improvement over field accommodation. Most soldiers would prefer comfort to mud and discomfort. But Duncan's response reflected something fundamental about how Australian SAS personnel approached military service in Vietnam. Australian SAS personnel were not in Vietnam to experience comfort. Australian SAS personnel were in Vietnam to conduct military operations. Everything else was secondary to that purpose. By 1967, Australian SAS had established a reputation for refusing comforts and for preferring to remain in field conditions, even when comfortable quarters were available. This preference reflected both practical military considerations and cultural attitudes toward military service. The practical consideration was that field conditions built and maintained operational capability. Soldiers who trained and lived in field conditions developed the kind of capability and endurance that soldiers living in comfortable quarters did not develop. An Australian SAS sergeant named William Torrance, the same engineer who had impressed female officers with his technical skill, explained the philosophy to an American officer who questioned why Australian SAS preferred field conditions. "Comfort makes you soft," Torrance said. "If you train and live in comfortable conditions, you become accustomed to comfort. When you deploy to field conditions, the transition is difficult. Your body is not accustomed to discomfort. Your mind is not accustomed to deprivation. We prefer to remain in field conditions because it maintains our operational capability. Comfort is a distraction from military effectiveness." This philosophy represented a different cultural attitude toward military service. American military culture valued the provision of comfortable conditions when such provision was possible. American military leadership believed that soldiers performed better when they were comfortable and well rested. Australian military culture valued the maintenance of operational capability through continuous exposure to field conditions. Australian military leadership believed that soldiers performed better when they were accustomed to discomfort and deprivation. These represented fundamentally different approaches to military readiness and military effectiveness. By 1968, the Australian preference for field conditions had become noticeable to American military observers. American military personnel would offer comfortable accommodations to Australian SAS personnel. Australian SAS personnel would decline and would prefer to remain in field conditions. American military observers found this preference to be incomprehensible. Why would soldiers prefer mud and discomfort to air conditioning and comfort? But the preference reflected something important about Australian military culture and Australian military philosophy. The preference reflected the belief that military effectiveness was more important than personal comfort. Colonel Michael Harrison conducted an informal study of Australian SAS personnel's preferences regarding accommodation. Harrison interviewed multiple Australian soldiers about why they preferred field conditions to comfortable quarters. The responses were consistent. Australian soldiers believed that remaining in field conditions maintained their operational capability. Australian soldiers believed that comfort was a distraction from military effectiveness. Australian soldiers believed that the best soldiers were soldiers who could function effectively in the worst possible conditions. One Australian officer made an observation that captured the philosophical difference. "The Americans believe that soldiers perform better when they are comfortable. We believe that soldiers perform better when they are comfortable with discomfort. There is a difference. We prefer soldiers who are comfortable in mud to soldiers who are comfortable in air-conditioned quarters. This observation highlighted the philosophical difference between American and Australian military cultures. The difference was not just about accommodation preferences. The difference was about fundamentally different beliefs about what produced military effectiveness. By 1969, Australian SAS had maintained its preference for field conditions throughout the war. Australian SAS personnel had remained in mud and discomfort when comfortable quarters were available. Australian SAS personnel had refused comforts that would have been appreciated by most soldiers. This refusal had contributed to the reputation that Australian SAS had developed. Australian SAS was known as a unit that valued military effectiveness above personal comfort. Australian SAS was known as a unit that maintained operational capability through continuous exposure to field conditions. The American military, observing this preference, began to question whether its own approach to military accommodation was appropriate. Questions were raised about whether providing comfortable quarters was actually improving military effectiveness, or whether it was making soldiers soft and unprepared for field conditions. By 1970, as the Vietnam War was winding down, the Australian preference for field conditions had influenced how American military personnel thought about military readiness and military effectiveness. Some American military leaders began to question whether the provision of comfortable quarters was appropriate. Some American military leaders began to consider whether American soldiers would be more effective if they were trained and maintained in more austere conditions. General Creighton Abrams made an observation that reflected this shift in thinking. The Australians refused comfortable quarters because they believed that comfort compromises military effectiveness. We have provided comfortable quarters to American soldiers because we believe that comfort improved morale and military effectiveness. But perhaps the Australians are right. Perhaps soldiers who are accustomed to comfort are less effective in field conditions than soldiers who are accustomed to discomfort. This observation, made by the commander of MACV, represented a significant acknowledgement. The American military was questioning whether its approach to military accommodation was actually producing the most effective military personnel. By 1971, after the Vietnam War had essentially ended for most American forces, the question of how to balance military comfort with military effectiveness remained relevant. Special operations units, particularly, began to adopt more austere training and accommodation practices, based on the recognition that Australian SAS had developed through refusing comforts and remaining in field conditions. By 1980, special operations units throughout the American military had adopted training regimens that emphasized functioning in austere conditions and in field environments. The training regimens were explicitly based on the recognition that soldiers trained in austere conditions developed greater operational capability than soldiers trained in comfortable conditions. This represented a significant shift in American military culture. The shift was driven partly by the recognition that Australian SAS had maintained greater operational capability through refusing comfort and remaining in field conditions. Colonel Michael Harrison, who had conducted the study of Australian accommodation preferences, became an advocate for more austere training conditions. Harrison argued that American soldiers would be more effective if they trained and lived in conditions more similar to the field conditions they would encounter in actual military operations. By the year 2000, special operations training throughout the American military emphasized functioning in austere conditions. Training emphasized discomfort and deprivation as normal aspects of military operations, rather than as unusual circumstances to be minimized. This approach to training had origins that could be traced back to the recognition of how Australian SAS had maintained operational capability through refusing comfort and remaining in field conditions. One special operations instructor, when teaching a course on military readiness, made an observation that reflected the enduring influence of the Australian approach. The best soldiers are soldiers who are comfortable with discomfort. Training should develop soldiers who can function effectively in austere conditions rather than soldiers who require comfortable conditions to function effectively. The Australian SAS understood this principle. We are still learning it. This statement captured something essential about how Australian military culture had influenced American military thinking about military effectiveness and military readiness. The slouch hat represented Australian tactical adaptation. The boots represented Australian physical conditioning. The preference for field conditions represented something different. It represented Australian cultural philosophy about what produced military effectiveness. These represented different kinds of Australian influence on American military in Vietnam. All of them, combined, represented a broader transformation in how American military understood military effectiveness and military culture. By the year 2020, more than 50 years after Australian SAS had refused comfortable quarters and chosen to remain in field conditions, the principle remained relevant. Military training throughout the world emphasized functioning in austere conditions and developing the capability to perform effectively despite discomfort. This principle, while developed through multiple pathways and multiple military experiences, had significant origins in how Australian SAS had approached military training and military effectiveness in Vietnam. The Australian soldiers who had refused comfortable quarters had not intended to influence how American military approached training and readiness. They had simply been following their own military culture and their own philosophy about what produced military effectiveness. But the observation of that philosophy and the recognition of how Australian soldiers maintained greater operational capability through refusing comfort and remaining in field conditions had influenced how American military thought about military training and military effectiveness. That influence persisted long after the Vietnam War had ended, and long after the specific soldiers who had refused comfortable quarters had retired or passed away. The slouch hat was visible. The boots were visible. The preference for field conditions was less visible, but equally significant in how it had influenced military thinking about effectiveness and readiness. All of it traced back to Australian military culture and Australian understanding that military effectiveness was more important than personal comfort. That understanding had been transmitted through observation, through military training, through the recognition that soldiers who were comfortable with discomfort developed greater operational capability than soldiers who required comfort to function effectively. By the year 2025, Australian SAS remained one of the most respected and most feared special operations units in the world. The reputation was built partly on the methodology that Australian SAS had developed in Vietnam. The reputation was built partly on the philosophy that Australian SAS had embodied. The philosophy that military effectiveness was more important than personal comfort. That philosophy, embodied in soldiers who refused comfortable quarters and chose to remain in mud and field conditions, had become part of military culture and military understanding around the world.